Hello everyone, welcome to my channel Anonymous Women. So as discussed in the previous video, today we'll be starting with our NCERTs. The first one being the history textbook for class 6th, our PASTS 1. Let's get started. Let's get started with the background first. In ancient India, people lived on the banks of the rivers. They were called skilled gatherers. That is, people who gathered food and also hunted animals from the surrounding forest. In the adjacent map, you can see Suleiman and Keithar hills to the northwest. Let me just mark for you. Here are Keithar and this is Suleiman. So these are some of the areas where people first began to grow crops about 8,000 years ago. People also began rearing animals like sheep, goat and cattle. Next we have Garo Hills to the northeast and Vindhyas in central India. This is Garo Hills and these are Vindhyas. These are some other areas where agriculture developed. The places where rice was first grown are to the north of the Vindhyas, so somewhere here. Next, Indus and its tributaries. First of all, tributaries are smaller rivers that flow into a larger river. So here we have tributaries of Indus, Jhelum, Chenab, Ravi, Byas and Satluj. Some of the earlier cities flourished on the banks of these rivers. Later, cities developed on the banks of river Ganga and its tributaries and along the sea coast. There was a powerful kingdom Magad which was located to the south of Ganga along its tributary zone. So somewhere around this region. Let us see the history behind the name. Two names are used often for our country. First one is India and second one is Bharat. India comes from Indus, called Sindhu in Sanskrit. Iranians and Greeks who came through the northeast and were familiar with the Indus called as Hindos or the Indos, and the land to the east of the river was called India. Coming up to the next name, which is Bharat. This name was used for a group of people who lived in the northwest and who are mentioned in the Rig Veda, which is the earliest composition in Sanskrit. Later on, it was used for the name of our country. Next we have is ways of finding about past. There are various ways as have been mentioned herein. First is manuscripts. Manu means hand. So these are basically the handwritten scripts usually written on palm leaf or on the specially prepared bark of a tree known as the birch, which grows in the Himalayas. Many of these scripts were written in Sanskrit, others in Prakrit, which was known as the language of ordinary people, and then there were others in Tamil. Next we have inscriptions. Inscriptions are writings on relatively hard surfaces such as stone or metals. Then we have factory sites. These are the places where stone was found and where people made tools. Lastly, we have habitation cum factory sites. These are those factory sites that were used for habitation purpose. Let's talk about Stone Age now. Stone Age is divided into three categories: Paleolithic, Mesolithic and Neolithic. So Paleolithic can be further divided into two words, which is Paleo plus Lithos. Lithos means stone. So Paleolithic denotes Old Stone Age, Mesolithic stands for Middle Stone Age and Neolithic stands for New Stone Age. Paleolithic period ranged from 2 million years ago to 12,000 years ago, Mesolithic from 12,000 years ago to 10,000 years ago, and Neolithic from 10,000 years ago onwards. And further, Paleolithic was divided into three parts: lower, middle and upper Paleolithic. And this particular age covers 90% of human history. Talking about Harappan cities now. Harappa was the first city to be discovered. Hence, all other sites from where similar buildings and other things were found were described as Harappan. There were various special features of these Harappan cities. First is many of them were divided into two or more parts. To the west was smaller but higher part called citadel, and to the east was larger but lower part called the lower town. Walls of baked brick were built around each part. In some cities, special buildings were constructed on the citadel. For example, in Mohenjo-daro, a very special tank called the Great Bath was built, which was lined with bricks coated with plaster and made watertight with a layer of natural tar. There were steps leading down to it from two sides. while there were rooms on all sides. Fire altars where sacrifices may have been performed have been found at Kalibangan and Lothal. Many of these cities had covered drains. Many terracotta toys have also been found. Cotton was probably grown. Spindle whorls made of terracotta and faience were found, which were used to spin thread. They also grew wheat, barley, pulses, peas, rice, sesame, linseed, and mustard. Also, plow was used to dig the earth for turning the soil and planting seeds. And they reared cattle, sheep, goat, and buffalo. They also collected fruits like bear, caught fish, and hunted wild animals like the antelope. Next we have is Vedas. Vedas are totally four in number: Rig Ved, Samved, Yajurved, and Atharvaved. Rig Ved being the oldest, it was composed about 3500 years ago. It includes more than 1,000 hymns called Sukta, or which, well said, which are in the praise of various gods and goddesses. Rigved mentioned two groups who are described in terms of their work: the priests, who are sometimes called Brahmins, who performed various rituals, and the Rajas. Two words were used to describe the people or community as a whole. They were Jana and Vish. The word Vaishya comes from the word Vish. People who composed hymns called themselves Aryas and called their opponents Dasas and Dasyus. These Dasas and Dasyus did not perform sacrifices and spoke different languages. Later, the term Dasa came to mean slave. Next in line is the later Vedic period. It was characterized by Samved, Yajurved, Atharvaved, and other writings. They were composed by priests and described how rituals were to be performed. They also contained rules about society. Varna system was introduced by priests during this time. They divided people into four groups called Varnas on the basis of different set of functions and decided on the basis of birth. First was Brahmin. They were expected to study and teach the Vedas, perform sacrifices and receive gifts. Second were Kshatriyas. They were rulers and were expected to fight battles and protect people. Third were Vish or Vaishyas. They were expected to be farmers, herders, and traders. Both Kshatriyas and Vish or Vaishyas could perform sacrifices. Fourth being Shudras, these were the ones who had to serve the other three groups and could not perform any rituals. Also, the women grouped with Shudras were not allowed to study the Vedas. Next in line is Janpadas. The term Janpada refers to the land where the Jana set its foot and settled down. Number of settlements in these Janpadas have been found. For example, Purana Kila in Delhi, Hastinapur near Meerut, and Atranji Kheda near Etah in UP. The people of these Janpadas lived in huts, kept cattle and other animals. They grew rice, wheat, barley, pulses, sugarcane, sesame, and mustard. They made earthen pots which were grey and red in color. Also, painted greyware pottery belonging to these areas have been found, which had painted designs, usually simple lines and geometric patterns. After Janpadas, we have the Mahajanpadas. So, the Janpadas that became more important than others were known as the Mahajanpadas. They had a capital city. Many of these were fortified, that is, they had huge walls of wood, brick, or stone built around them. Armies started to be maintained during this period. Regular tax collection started, unlike in the case of the Raja of the Janpada, who was dependent upon the occasional gifts brought by people. Taxes on crops were the most important feature of these Mahajanpadas since most people were farmers. For example, Bhaga was introduced, which was a tax which valued to one-sixth of the crop produced. Craftspersons were taxed in the form of labor, herders were taxed in the form of animals and animal produce, and hunters and gatherers were taxed in the form of forest produce. There were various changes in agriculture. For example, now there was a growing use of iron plowshares against the wooden ones, and transplantation of paddy began during these periods. The slave men and women, which were known as dasas and dasis, and the landless agricultural laborers, which were known as kamakars, they were made to do agricultural plantation work in this period. Now we talk about Buddha and Buddhism. The founder of Buddhism was Siddhartha. He was also known as Gautam. He belonged to a small gun known as Sakya gun and was a Kshatriya. He attained enlightenment under a peepal tree at Bodh Gaya in Bihar. Post that, he was known as Buddha or the Wise One. Then he went to Sarnath near Varanasi where he taught for the first time. Later, he passed away at Kusinara. He taught that life is full of suffering and unhappiness caused because of cravings and desires. He described them as thirst or tanha and also taught people to be kind towards others, including animals. He mainly taught in Prakrit, which was the language of ordinary people, so that everyone could understand. Now we have the Upanishads, which are a part of later Vedic texts. Upanishads literally mean approaching and sitting near. These texts contain conversations between teachers and students. These are simply the ideas presented through simple dialogues. Basically, they are a compilation of ideas of various thinkers of this time who felt that there was something permanent in this universe that lasts even after death. They describe this as Atman or the individual soul and the Brahman or the universal soul. It was believed that ultimately both the Atman and the Brahman were one. Mostly these thinkers were men, especially Brahmins and Rajas, though there were some exceptions as well. For example, there was Gargi, who was a women thinker. Poor people rarely took part. There was an exception to this as well, who was Satyakam Jabala. He was named after his mother, who was a slave woman, Jabali. He was accepted as a student by a Brahmin teacher and was named Gautama. Later, these were developed by famous thinker Shankaracharya. Now we talk about Mahavira and Jainism. Jaina comes from the term Jina, which means conqueror. The most famous thinker of Jainism was Vardhaman Mahavira. He was a Kshatriya prince of the Lichvis, which was a part of Vajji Sangha. He taught that men and women who wish to know truth must leave their homes and follow the rules of Ahimsa. The language used by him was Prakrit, which was common people's language. The followers were known as Jainas. They gave up everything, including clothes, and led a simple life begging for food. Jainism was supported mainly by traders. Mahavira's teachings, as they were originally written, are placed at Vallabhi in Gujarat. Next we have is the system of ashramas. Around the same time when Jainism and Buddhism were becoming popular, the Brahmins developed the system of ashramas. It is a term used for a stage of life. There were four ashramas that were recognized. First one being Brahmacharya, in which the Brahmins, Kshatriyas and Vaishyas men were expected to lead simple lives and study the Vedas during the early years of their lives. Second being Grihast, in it was expected to marry and live as householders. Third being Vanprasth, wherein it was expected to live in the forest and meditate. Last being Sannyasins, wherein it was expected to give up everything at the end. Women were not allowed to study the Vedas and had to follow the ashramas chosen by their husbands. Now we talk about the Mauryan Empire. Its capital was situated at Patliputra. Takshila was a gateway to the northwest, including the Central Asia, while Ujjain was laid on the route from north to South India. The merchant, officials and craftspersons lived in these cities, which is Patliputra, Takshila and Ujjain. The area around Patliputra was under the direct control of the emperor. Ashoka was one of the most famous Mauryan ruler. Most of his inscriptions were in Prakrit and were written in Brahmi script. Kalinga, which is the ancient name of coastal Orissa, played a very important role in the Mauryan Empire history. Ashoka, on seeing the bloodshed during the Kalinga war, decided not to find any more wars. Thus, he is the only king in the history of the world who gave up conquest after winning a war and decided to observe Dhamma. Dhamma is the Prakrit word for the Sanskrit term dharma. Ashoka's Dhamma did not involve worship of a god or performance of a sacrifice. Instead, he appointed officials who were known as Dhamma Mahamatta, who went from place to place teaching people about Dhamma. He got his messages inscribed on rocks and pillars, instructing his officials to read them to those who could not read themselves. Next we have is the Sangam literature. These were some of the earliest works in Tamil. They were called Sangam because they were supposed to have been composed and compiled in assemblies which are known as Sangams of poets that were held in the city of Madurai. During this time, there were at least three different kinds of people living in most villages in the southern and northern parts of the subcontinent. In the north, they were called as Gram Bojaka. He was the village headman. It was a hereditary post and often the largest landowner. Also functioned as a judge and sometimes as a policeman. Next, we had Grihapatis. They were independent farmers, mostly small landowners. Then we had Dasa Karmakaras. They did not own land and earned living by working on others' field. Now in the south we had Villalar, they were large landowners. Then we had Uzavar, who were ordinary plowmen. And then we have Kadaisiar and Adimai, they were landless laborers including the slaves. Coming towards south, we find that the South India was famous for gold, spices, especially pepper, and precious stones. Pepper was particularly valued in the Roman Empire, so much so that it was known as black gold. Kaveri was the most fertile river valley of the south. Sangam poets mentioned Movendar. It was a Tamil word for three chiefs and was used for the heads of three ruling families, which were Cholas, Cheras, and Pandyas. Each chief had two centers of powers, one inland and one on the coast. Now, of total these six cities, two were very important. One was Puhar or Kaveripatnam, which was the port of the Cholas, and the second was Madurai, which was the capital of the Pandyas. The chief did not collect regular taxes. Instead, they demanded and received gifts from the people. They also went on military expeditions and collected tribute from neighboring areas. Around 200 years later, a dynasty known as the Satavahanas became powerful in the western India. Gautami Putra Shri Satkarni was most important ruler of the Satavahanas. His mother was Gautami Balashri. He and other Satvahana rulers were known as the lords of the Dakshin Patha. Dakshin Path literally means the route leading to the south, which was also used as a name for the entire southern region. Next we have is the Silk Route. Silk was first invented in China around 7,000 years ago. Some people from China who went to distant lands on foot, horseback and on camels carried silk with them. The paths they followed came to be known as the Silk Route. The best known rulers who controlled the Silk Route were the Kushanas, who ruled over Central Asia and Northwest India around 2000 years ago. Their two major centers of power were Peshawar and Mathura. Takshila was also included in their kingdom. The Kushanas were amongst the earliest rulers of the subcontinent to issue gold coins. These were used by the traders along the Silk Route. What we talk about is the spread of Buddhism. Kanishka was the most famous Kushana ruler. Ashwaghosa, who was Kanishka's court poet, composed a biography of Buddha, which was known as the Buddha Charita. He and other Buddhist scholars began writing in Sanskrit. At this time, a new form of Buddhism known as Mahayana Buddhism had developed. This had two distinct features. First one being Buddha's presence was shown in sculpture by using certain signs. For example, his attainment of enlightenment was shown by sculptures of the peepal tree. Now, the statues of the Buddha were made. Many of these were made in Mathura, while others were made in Takshila. Second being the belief in Bodhisattvas. Bodhisattvas were supposed to be persons who had attained enlightenment. They remained in the world to teach and help other people. Now, the older form of Buddhism, known as the Theravada Buddhism, was more popular in Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Thailand, and other parts of Southeast Asia, including Indonesia. With this started the beginning of Bhakti movement. Bhakti comes from the term Sanskrit term bhaj, which means to divide or share. This suggests an intimate two-way relationship between the deity and the devotee. This was the time when worship of certain deities like Shiva, Vishnu and goddesses such as Durga became a central feature of later Hinduism. Bhakti is generally understood as a person's devotion to his or her chosen deity and could be followed by anyone irrespective of gender, class or caste. The idea of bhakti is also present in Bhagavad Gita, which is a sacred book of the Hindus which is included in the Mahabharata. Those who followed the system of bhakti emphasized devotion and individual worship of a god or goddess. They believed if they worship the chosen deity with a pure heart, the deity will appear in the form in which he or she may desire, as a human being, lion, tree, or any other form. The artists made beautiful images of these deities. Most bhakti literature tells us that riches, learning, and high status do not automatically ensure a close relationship with the deity. Bhakti thus inspired some of the best expressions in art, which are sculpture, poetry, and architecture. Now we talk about the Gupta period. First, let us discuss about Samudragupta. He was a famous ruler of the Gupta dynasty. The knowledge about him is gained from a long inscription, which is actually a poem in Sanskrit composed by his court poet Harisena nearly 1700 years ago. This was inscribed on the Ashokan pillar at Allahabad. This inscription is of a special kind known as a prashasti, which is a Sanskrit word meaning in praise of. Samudragupta has been praised in glowing terms as a warrior, as a king who won victories in battle, who was learned and was best of poets, and also described as equal to the gods. Harisena has also described four different kinds of rulers and tell us about Samudragupta's policies towards them. Samudragupta's mother Kumara Devi belonged to the Lichvi Gand, while his father Chandragupta was first ruler of the Gupta dynasty to adopt the grand title of Maharaj Adhiraj, a title that Samudragupta also used. His great-grandfather and grandfather are mentioned simply as Maharajas. His court was full of learned people, including Kalidas, the poet, and Aryabhatta, the astronomer. Kalidas is known for his plays depicting life in the king's court. In his plays, most Brahmins are shown as speaking Sanskrit, while women and men other than the king and Brahmins use Prakrit. His most famous play, Abhijanana Shakuntalam, is the story of the love between a king named Dushyant and a young woman named Shakuntala. Aryabhatta, on the other hand, was a mathematician and astronomer. He wrote a book in Sanskrit known as Aryabhatiyam, wherein he stated that days and nights are caused by rotation of Earth on its axis. He also found a way of calculating the circumference of a circle and developed a scientific explanation for eclipses as well. Next we have is Harshvardhan, who ruled nearly 1400 years ago. His court poet Bana Bhatta wrote his biography, which was known as the Harshcharita in Sanskrit. Chinese traveler Xuan Sang spent time in his court. Later, he was defeated by Pulikeshin II, who was the ruler of the Chalukya dynasty. Our last topic for today is the Southern Kingdom. The Pallavas and the Chalukyas were the most important ruling dynasties in the South India during this period. The kingdom of the Pallavas spread from the region around their capital, Kanchipuram, to the Kaveri Delta, while that of the Chalukyas was centered around the Raichur Doab between the rivers Krishna and the river Tungabhadra. Aihole, the capital of the Chalukyas, was an important trading center of this time. The Pallavas and Chalukyas frequently raided one another's lands, especially attacking the capital cities, which were prosperous towns. The best known Chalukya ruler was Pulikeshin II, who is known from a prashasti composed by his court poet Ravi Kirti. Gradually, both the Pallavas and the Chalukyas gave way to new rulers belonging to the Rashtrakuta and the Chola dynasties. Kings of this time maintained a well-organized army with elephants, chariots, cavalry, and foot soldiers. There were military leaders who provided the king with troops in times of need. These military leaders were not paid regular salaries but received grants of land. They collected revenue from the land and used this to maintain soldiers and horses and provide equipment for warfare. These men were known as Samantas and they tried to become independent whenever the ruler was weak. The inscription of the Pallavas mentions a number of local assemblies. They were Sabha, which was an assembly of Brahmin landowners and looked after irrigation, agricultural operations, making roads, local temples, etc. Next was Ur, which was a village assembly found in areas where the landowners were not Brahmins. Then there was Nagaram. It was an organization of merchants. It is likely that these assemblies were controlled by rich and powerful landowners and merchants. So friends, with this we finish our today's video of class 6 history textbook of NCERT. Your comments, queries and suggestions are most welcomed. Please like and share this video and subscribe to my channel Anonymous Women and give your share of contribution towards digital education. On this note, this is me Anonymous Women signing off for now. Thank you very much. Goodbye.